Last Wish, a prisoner sentenced to the electric chair asked to speak with his daughter moments before his execution. When the girl handed a letter to the judge, everyone in the courtroom was terrified by what was written. The sun rose lazily over John Miller's auto repair shop, a modest yet respected establishment in the local community. The tools, meticulously organized on the time-worn walls, reflected the first golden rays filtering through the dusty windows. John, a 45-year-old man with kind eyes and calloused hands hardened by years of labor, was already immersed in his morning routine, bent over the engine of an old car. His blue uniform, stained with grease and marked by years of wear, silently told the story of countless hours dedicated to the craft he had learned from his father. The walls of the shop, adorned with technical posters and certificates, showcased a collection of photographs that revealed fragments of his life, moments with satisfied customers, local awards for community service, and most prominently, portraits of his family. The dawn at the shop always brought a familiar procession of customers, many of whom John had known for years. Mrs. Thompson, a 65-year-old widow who relied on her old sedan to take her grandchildren to school, was a constant presence. John had refused to charge her for car repairs during her last 3 visits, knowing the hardships she faced since her husband's passing. This generosity was not an exception, but a pattern that repeated itself often, especially with the elderly and families struggling financially. The community knew him not just as the most reliable mechanic in the region, but also as someone who valued people over profit, a rare trait in modern times. In an increasingly impersonal world, his shop had become a gathering place where people could count on a friendly ear and a helping hand. The afternoon found John in his modest home, a simple yet cozy place that echoed with memories of his late wife. The kitchen, the heart of the house, was where his daughters, 9-year-old Emma and 16-year-old Lisa, usually waited for him after school. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and newly made sandwiches filled the air, an attempt by Lisa to recreate the warmth their mother used to provide. The kitchen walls narrated the family's story through photographs: John's wedding, the birth of his daughters, birthdays, graduations, and special moments that now seemed to belong to a different life. Since his wife's passing 3 years ago, John juggled 2 jobs to keep his daughters comfortable, and most importantly, to ensure they never felt a lack of love in their lives. His relationship with Lisa was becoming more challenging as she entered adolescence. She swung between moments of surprising maturity, when she helped care for her younger sister and managed household chores, and bouts of rebellion typical of her age. John often found himself lying awake late at night, pondering the choices he made as a single father, questioning whether he was being too strict or too lenient. The shadow of fear, of losing his daughters, whether to the wrong influences or the dangers of the world, haunted him constantly. Emma, on the other hand, displayed wisdom beyond her years, often acting as a bridge between her father and older sister, even though her eyes carried a sadness no child should know so young. Evenings at the shop were different. The second shift brought a peculiar calm, broken only by the soft hum of the radio and the occasional clinking of tools. It was during these solitary hours that John allowed his thoughts to drift to his wife, reminiscing about the plans they had made together and how life had taken such a different turn. The night work was necessary to supplement his income, especially with the growing expenses of raising 2 daughters, but it also served as a form of therapy, a productive solitude where he could process his thoughts and worries. It was during one of these reflective nights that fate chose to completely alter the course of his life, though he was yet unaware of it. The silence of the shop was abruptly shattered by the blaring sound of sirens. Through the foggy windows, red and blue lights began to dance on the walls, casting ghostly shadows among the tools. John dropped the wrench he was holding, his heart racing as he tried to comprehend what was happening. In a matter of seconds, the shop's door was violently thrown open, and a team of heavily armed police officers stormed in, their flashlights slicing through the dimness like blades of light. Shouts of "Police!" and "Hands where we can see them!" echoed through the space, transforming John's nightly sanctuary into a chaotic nightmare. His hands, still stained with grease, trembled as he slowly raised them, his mind a storm of confusion and fear. The initial questioning took place right there in the shop that had long been his refuge. The detectives, their immaculate suits contrasting sharply with the working-class setting, bombarded John with questions about his whereabouts the previous night. Words like homicide and forensic evidence hung in the air like a toxic fog as investigators methodically searched every corner of the shop. John watched, stunned, as his life was turned upside down before his eyes. Tools were catalogued as potential evidence. Photographs were taken of seemingly insignificant stains, and every document was scrutinized with unsettling thoroughness. The familiar smell of oil and metal now felt suffocating, mingling with the tension and fear that filled the room. The reality of the situation hit John like a punch to the stomach when the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. The cold metal against his skin seemed to drain all the warmth from his body, leaving only an icy emptiness in his chest. As he was led out of the shop, his thoughts were not on the crime he was being accused of, but on his daughters, sleeping at home, unaware that their lives were about to fall apart. The walk to the police car felt like an eternity, each step echoing like a hammer striking his fate. The flashing lights of the police cars continued to illuminate the scene, now drawing the attention of neighbors, who began to gather on their porches, some still in their nightclothes, all witnessing the moment when the respected John Miller was taken away like a common criminal. At the police station, the reality of the accusation was revealed in all its terrifying magnitude. A brutal murder had occurred the previous night, and all the evidence pointed to John. Sitting in the cold and impersonal interrogation room, he listened in shock as the lead detective detailed the evidence. Fingerprints found at the crime scene, witnesses claiming to have seen him in the area, and what appeared to be blood on one of his tools. The detective's words sounded distant and surreal, as if he were describing a movie in which John had no part. His mind drifted between disbelief and the growing terror of what this would mean for his daughters. The state-appointed lawyer whispered advice into his ear, but John could barely process the words, his thoughts fixed solely on the image of Emma and Lisa waking up to discover that their father had been arrested. Dawn found John in a cell, the early morning hours bringing not the promise of a new day, but the cruel reality of his situation. Through the small barred window, he could see the sun rising, the same sun that usually greeted him as he opened his shop for another honest day of work. The metallic sound of prison doors opening and closing, the guards' voices, and the occasional shout of other inmates formed a macabre symphony that felt both distant and painfully real. His hands, now clean of grease but marked by fingerprint ink, gripped the bars of his cell as his mind desperately tried to piece together an explanation, an escape, anything that could make sense of this nightmare that had become his reality. News of John Miller's arrest spread through the community like wildfire, quickly turning his daughters' lives into a whirlwind of chaos and despair. Lisa woke to the sound of insistent knocking at the door. It was the social worker, accompanied by police officers, there to inform her that their father had been arrested and that the girls would need to be temporarily placed with an aunt. Emma's face, usually lit by an innocent smile, was streaked with tears as she clung to her school backpack, as if that familiar object could somehow anchor her in the world crumbling around her. Lisa, trying to hold herself together for her younger sister, mechanically packed some clothes, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, while whispering repeatedly to herself that this must be a mistake, that her father couldn't have done this, that someone had made a terrible error that would soon be corrected. In the small prison cell, John faced the first day of his new reality with an anguish that seemed to consume every cell of his body. The cold grey walls seemed to close in on him as he imagined his daughters discovering his arrest, enduring the stares and whispers of the neighbors, being forced to leave the only home they had ever known. Each minute dragged on like an eternity, filled with tormenting thoughts about Emma and Lisa's well-being. The weight of being forcibly separated from his daughters, combined with the public humiliation and the instant destruction of the reputation he had built over decades, created a vortex of despair that threatened to swallow him whole. In a moment of absolute vulnerability, alone in his cell, John Miller, the man who had always been a pillar of strength for his family and community, finally let the tears fall, his body shaking with silent sobs as the enormity of his situation hit him in successive waves of emotional devastation. The constant hum of the prison's fluorescent lights filled the silence of the cell as John Miller tried to absorb his new reality. His orange uniform, rough against his skin, seemed to announce his current condition with every movement. The thin mattress offered little protection against the metal frame of the bed, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the storm in his mind. Every sound, the dragging of chains in the corridor, the metallic echo of slamming doors, the distant voices of other inmates, felt like a hammer striking home the fact that this wasn't a nightmare he could wake up from. His hands, accustomed to constant work with tools and engines, now trembled slightly as he held the metal cup of the prison's barely drinkable coffee, his first of many to come in an indefinite future. The state-appointed lawyer sat across the table in the visitation room, his worn briefcase overflowing with crumpled papers from other equally desperate cases. His words hung in the air like death sentences: substantial circumstantial evidence, preventive detention guaranteed, possibility of maximum sentence. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify every legal term that sealed John's fate a little more. The clinical detachment with which the lawyer discussed decades of John's potential life lost brutally, contrasted with the emotional storm raging inside him. The newspaper headlines the lawyer brought, with John's name splashed beside words like brutal and shocking, felt like they belonged to a story about someone else, a stranger who just happened to share his name. The guest room in Aunt Margaret's house had become an involuntary sanctuary for Lisa, who spent hours lying on the borrowed bed scrolling endlessly through her phone screen. Notifications arrived in relentless waves, messages from supposed friends distancing themselves politely, cruel comments from unknown numbers, and worst of all, the deafening silence from those who had once been part of her daily life. The school group chat, once lively with plans and laughter, now remained eerily silent whenever she appeared online, as though her last name had become a contagious disease. Her fingers hovered over old conversations, rereading messages from simpler times, as silent tears stained the phone screen. Beside her, Emma slept fitfully, still wearing their father's sweatshirt, which she had secretly taken before they left home. The auto repair shop, now cordoned off with yellow police tape, became a grim pilgrimage site for the local community. Groups of former clients and neighbors gathered on nearby sidewalks, their voices a constant murmur of theories and speculation. Mrs. Thompson stood slightly apart from the others, her wrinkled hands clutching the strap of her purse, as she watched investigators go in and out of what she once considered a sanctuary of trust. Mr. Jenkins, a customer for over a decade, alternated between fiercely defending John's integrity and quietly questioning whether he had ever truly known the man he trusted to fix his delivery truck. Stories of John's generosity, once admired by all, were now dissected in search of hidden motives, with each act of kindness reframed as potential evidence of a manipulative nature. The news spread through the school like wildfire, turning every hallway into a runway of stares and whispers. Emma, once one of the most popular students in her class, now walked the halls alone, clutching her superhero backpack to her chest as if it were a shield. Teachers who once praised her openly now showed their sympathy through tense smiles and simplified assignments, as though she had not only lost her father, but also her ability to learn. During recess, other children subtly moved away when she approached, their parents having warned them to be cautious around the killer's daughter, words Emma overheard accidentally in the school parking lot. The world she knew was crumbling, not in dramatic explosions, but in an endless series of small rejections, each cutting deeper than the last. The loneliness of his cell on the first night after the custody hearing weighed on John like a suffocating shroud. The words of Prosecutor Hayes echoed cruelly in his mind. A predator disguised as a model citizen, using his reputation as a trustworthy mechanic to gain the community's confidence. The judge had been merciless in denying bail, citing the heinous nature of the crime and the substantial evidence presented by the prosecution. More painful than the official statements were the expressions he had caught in the courtroom gallery, the horror in Emma's eyes, Lisa's silent tears, and the looks of disgust from former clients who had come to witness his public humiliation. Each breath felt like a conscious effort, as the reality of his situation crushed him with renewed force. The financial reality unraveled in his mind like a slow-motion horror film. The shop, his sole source of income, was indefinitely closed, while bills continued to pile up with merciless precision. The mortgage on the house, the girls' school fees, even the utility bill he had planned to pay at the end of the week. Every financial obligation now seemed like an insurmountable mountain. The public defender, overburdened and indifferent, had bluntly suggested that a plea deal might result in a lighter sentence, as though decades in prison instead of the electric chair or life without parole were some form of mercy. Aunt Margaret, already struggling with her own financial difficulties, couldn't keep the girls indefinitely, and the looming spectre of the foster care system hung over his thoughts like a constant threat. In moments of absolute despair, his mind wandered to his late wife, and he found himself envying her eternal peace. In his cell, as the hours dragged on endlessly, John felt something fundamental breaking inside him. Every dream he had nurtured for his daughters, every hope of seeing them grow up, graduate, and marry, all of it now seemed like a cruel joke played by fate. The thought of becoming nothing more than a shameful stain in their lives, a family secret to be hidden, a name they might eventually change to avoid association, this was a unique kind of torture that ate away at his soul. The last thread of hope keeping him connected to his former life seemed to have finally snapped, leaving only a deafening void where there once was a father, a respected community member, a man with purpose. In the darkness of his cell, John Miller finally allowed despair to consume him entirely, his silent tears marking the end of everything he once was and had dreamed of being. Sarah Bennett stared at the pile of cases on her desk through the steam rising from her third cup of coffee that morning. The office of the Innocence Institute was still quiet in the early hours, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers being shuffled. Her eyes burned after yet another sleepless night, haunted by the same nightmares she had endured for 30 years, her father being led away in handcuffs, his cries of innocence echoing through the courthouse, and the judge's gavel sealing his fate. The case on her desk now, John Miller's, was just another in an endless stack of potential injustices, but something about it stopped her from simply moving it to the pending review pile. Perhaps it was the photographs attached to the file. The same look of disbelief her father had worn was etched on this mechanic's face. The same kind of circumstantial evidence that had condemned her father now threatened to destroy another family. The police report seemed flawless at first glance, meticulously constructed with physical evidence, eyewitness testimonies, and a record of John Miller's presence near the crime scene. Sarah had seen hundreds of similar cases throughout her career, most of them legitimately solid, yet her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the transcripts of witness statements. Something in her intuition, sharpened by years of experience, screamed that there were missing pieces in this seemingly perfect puzzle. The statements from Miller's daughters caught her particular attention. There were nuances between the lines, hesitations in the transcribed responses that seemed to beg for deeper interpretation. Her finger traced a specific line from the testimony of the elder daughter, Lisa, where the teenager appeared on the verge of breaking before reaffirming her father's alibi for that fateful night. Years of experience had taught Sarah that sometimes the truth was hidden, not in what was said, but in the silences between the words. A family photo attached to the case file showed John Miller in happier times, surrounded by his 2 daughters and his late wife, all smiling in front of the auto repair shop. Sarah couldn't help the lump that formed in her throat. The image was painfully similar to one that had once sat on the dining table in her own home before the justice system tore her family apart. Her boss had warned her countless times about the dangers of becoming emotionally involved in her cases, but Sarah knew it was precisely her emotional connection that made her so effective at her work. While other lawyers saw statistics and precedents, she saw families, interrupted lives, and the chilling possibility that the system she had sworn to serve was about to commit another irreversible mistake. Taking a deep breath, Sarah picked up her phone and began dialing the prison. She needed to hear John Miller's story directly, to look into his eyes and see if she could find the same desperate truth she had seen in her father's eyes 3 decades ago. The prison visitation room was a study in shades of gray, from the faded walls to the guards' uniforms, their watchful eyes tired yet attentive. Sarah Bennett sat across from John Miller, her notes methodically arranged on the metal table between them. The first interview had already stretched to 3 hours, and something in John's account continued to resonate with her expertise. It wasn't just his words, but the small details in his behavior. The way his eyes shifted when mentioning specific moments from the night of the crime, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands when speaking about his daughters. the pauses that lasted just a little too long before answering certain questions about his whereabouts. To an untrained eye, these might have appeared as signs of guilt, but to Sarah, they were indicators of a man bearing a weight far heavier than the accusations against him. The following days became a marathon of frenetic investigation. Sarah practically moved into her office, turning an entire wall into a detailed map of the case. Photographs, police reports, witness transcripts, and newspaper clippings connected by red strings as she tried to find patterns in the chaos. Her nights were spent rereading every document in the file, searching for inconsistencies that others might have missed. Prosecutor Hayes had built what appeared to be a solid case, but Sarah began noticing small discrepancies in the reported timelines, witnesses whose statements seemed too rehearsed, and circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Each discovery, no matter how minor, was like a piece of a puzzle that didn't yet reveal the full picture, but hinted at a troubling pattern of hasty conclusions and shallow investigation. Visits to John's auto repair shop, no longer sealed off as a crime scene, revealed an environment that contradicted the prosecution's narrative. Sarah spent hours speaking with neighbors and former clients, gathering stories that painted a very different picture of the calculated predator described in court. Mrs. Thompson, in particular, wept as she recounted how John had repaired her car free of charge over the past few months, knowing about her financial struggles after her husband's death. Among John's meticulous records, Sarah found dozens of invoices marked as forgiven for customers in financial difficulty, a pattern of generosity that spanned years. This wasn't evidence that could directly prove innocence, but it built a context that made the accusations increasingly implausible in her experienced eyes. Most intriguing, however, were the interviews with John's daughters. While Emma, the younger one, could barely speak through her sobs, Lisa displayed a composure that Sarah found unsettling for a teenager whose life had been so abruptly shattered. There was something in the older girl's eyes, a burden that seemed far heavier than the simple grief of seeing her father wrongfully accused. During her third visit to Aunt Margaret's house, Sarah noticed how Lisa always positioned herself between Sarah and certain areas of the house, as if guarding something more than just painful memories. The lawyer recognized the subtle signs of someone carrying a devastating secret. She herself had exhibited similar behaviors during the years she fought to prove her father's innocence. It was during a particularly frustrating afternoon that Sarah found something that would change the course of her investigation. While re-examining the crime scene photographs for the 10th time, her eyes caught a previously overlooked detail, a small piece of paper partially visible under one of the pieces of furniture, seemingly ignored by the forensic team as insignificant. Zooming in on the image on her computer and adjusting the contrast, she was able to make out what appeared to be a crumpled receipt with a specific date and time. The detail itself might not have seemed remarkable, but what caught her attention was the partially visible logo. It was from a diner near Lisa's school, not the auto repair shop where the prosecution alleged John had been planning the crime. The time on the receipt, though only partially legible, matched the window during which John was supposedly preparing the crime scene. Sarah's heart raced as she realized this could be the first concrete evidence that the prosecution's timeline was fundamentally flawed. The lawyer spent the following hours immersed in a frantic analysis of Lisa's school records, cross-referencing class schedules and extracurricular activities with the timeline of the crime established by the prosecution. A pattern began to emerge. On the days leading up to the crime, there were records of Lisa leaving school early, along with unexplained absences that coincided with other minor incidents in the area that police had initially connected to the main crime. Sarah noticed something even more significant while reviewing the transcripts of security footage. In the recordings analyzed by the police, a figure with physical characteristics matching John appeared at various moments, but in none of the images was the face clearly visible. The build could easily belong to someone else, someone younger perhaps with a similar height and frame. The thought made Sarah freeze in her chair, a disturbing theory beginning to take shape in her mind. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Emma, John's youngest daughter, her eyes red from crying but with a surprising determination on her young face. "Miss Bennet," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something I need to show you." In her small hands she held what looked like a diary. At that moment, Sarah felt the first real spark of hope. Not just as a lawyer following leads, but as a little girl bravely choosing to trust her with something that could change everything. The weight of the moment was not lost on Sarah. She recognized in Emma's eyes the same kind of pain and determination she had carried when fighting to save her own father. Sarah sat still in her office, Emma's diary open on her desk like a ticking time bomb. The childlike pages, decorated with stickers of stars and hearts, contained much more than the typical musings of a 9-year-old. They were a silent testament to a shattered family and truths that had been buried for too long. The lawyer ran her fingers gently across the pages, noting how the girl's handwriting changed as events unfolded, the letters becoming shakier, some pages stained with what were clearly tears. The contrast between the colorful stickers and the dark content of the entries created a painful dissonance that tightened Sarah's chest, brutally reminding her that at the heart of this sensational case was a child bearing a burden far too heavy for her small shoulders. With the diary as her starting point, Sarah began to reconstruct the days leading up to the crime, but not through police reports or forensic evidence. She sought the human story hidden behind the official facts. Her conversations with the neighbors now had a new focus, not just the events of that fateful night, but the subtle changes in the Miller family's behavior in the weeks prior. Mrs. Thompson, her tears barely contained, recalled how Lisa had started showing up at the repair shop more frequently, always appearing agitated, always whispering with her father in conversations that abruptly stopped whenever someone approached. Mr. Jenkins mentioned seeing the teenager wandering the neighborhood at odd hours, seemingly lost in dark thoughts. Each new account added not just information, but layers of emotion to the story Sarah was beginning to piece together. In the small interview room at the prison, Sarah observed John with new eyes as he spoke about his daughters. Now she noticed the subtle signs she had missed before, how his voice trembled slightly when mentioning specific days, how his hands twisted nervously when talking about Lisa's school activities, how his gaze drifted into the distance when certain dates were brought up. These weren't the gestures of a man hiding his own guilt. They were the signs of someone protecting a devastating secret that threatened to destroy what remained of his family. The truth was beginning to take shape, not in official documents or physical evidence, but in the silences, the hesitations, and the haunted looks of a family carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. The judicial system's resistance to reopening the Miller case stood like an impenetrable wall. Prosecutor Hayes, in particular, reacted with increasing hostility to each of Sarah's requests to re-evaluate evidence. During one especially tense meeting in his office, his words cut through the air like razors. "You're just reopening old wounds, Bennett. The victim's family deserves peace." The weight of those words followed Sarah through her sleepless nights, forcing her to question whether her pursuit of the truth might be causing more pain than justice. On her desk, photographs of the victim's family seemed to stare at her accusingly, reminding her that each twist in the case forced others to relive their own tragedy. The conflict between seeking the truth and respecting others' grief consumed her, turning every new discovery into a simultaneous source of hope and guilt. Emma was beginning to show alarming signs of stress caused by the investigation. Her teacher reported that the once cheerful and engaged girl now spent her classes obsessively drawing the same scene over and over, a solitary figure behind what appeared to be bars. Her previously exemplary grades had plummeted. During visits to her father in prison, she could barely make eye contact, her small fingers constantly gripping the diary she now carried like an anchor. Lisa, on the other hand, had developed a growing hostility towards Sarah's investigation. The teenager began skipping scheduled interviews, and when she did attend, her answers became increasingly evasive and defensive. The tension between the sisters was visibly mounting. Emma withdrew whenever Lisa entered the same room, and their normal conversations had been replaced by charged silences filled with unspoken meanings. Aunt Margaret mentioned that the girls who once shared a room had now requested to sleep separately, a change she attributed to the stress of the situation, though Sarah suspected deeper reasons. John himself was beginning to show extreme signs of strain in the prison environment. His meetings with Sarah were marked by moments of confusion and increasingly frequent memory lapses. The prison doctor had increased his anxiety medication, and the deep shadows under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights. During one particularly difficult visit, He begged Sarah to stop the investigation. "My daughters have already lost their mother, and now they're losing their childhood to this nightmare." His voice trembled with a mix of desperation and resolve as he continued, "Some truths need to stay buried, Sarah. Please let this go." The plea in his eyes carried a weight that transcended his own freedom, making Sarah question whether there were ethical boundaries to her pursuit of the truth, especially when that truth threatened to tear apart the fragile remnants of an already broken family. The discovery came by chance during a seemingly routine visit to Aunt Margaret's house. Sarah had noticed how Lisa always avoided her old bedroom, now turned into an improvised storage room for belongings hastily brought from their former home. Seizing a moment when the teenager had left for school, Sarah decided to take one last look around. Among stacked boxes and packed-away memories, something caught her eye. A small school notebook that had fallen behind an old dresser, its crumpled pages covered with a thin layer of dust. It wasn't the diary Emma had given her, but something different. A sketchbook belonging to Lisa, filled with what seemed like random notes and abstract drawings. What captured Sarah's experienced eye, however, were the dates scribbled in the margins, aligning perfectly with the days leading up to the crime. Amid the adolescent doodles, there were notes about times, locations, and initials that formed a disturbing pattern when matched with the crime's timeline. One particular page made Sarah's heart skip a beat, a crude map of the neighborhood where the crime had occurred, with specific markings and numbers that initially seemed nonsensical. Comparing it to her own case notes, she realized the numbers corresponded to time intervals, creating a sequence that completely contradicted the prosecution's version of events. On the back of the page, a single phrase written and repeatedly crossed out caught her attention. "Dad can't know." But what truly made Sarah freeze was a stain in the bottom corner of the page. Not ink or pencil, but what appeared to be a small drop of dried blood. Holding the notebook with trembling hands, Sarah knew she had stumbled upon not just a clue, but possibly the thread that, if pulled correctly, could unravel the entire tapestry of lies surrounding this case. The execution date, once a distant threat, now loomed over everyone like a suffocating shadow. Sarah stared at the calendar on her wall, where the remaining days seemed to evaporate at an alarming rate. Prosecutor Hayes had managed to expedite the final proceedings, citing the need for closure for the community. His arguments before the judge had been ruthless. "The defense is merely delaying the inevitable, Your Honor, toying with the emotions of everyone involved." Those words now haunted Sarah during her sleepless nights, mingling with the doubts in her own mind. The weight of holding not only John's life, but the future of two already traumatized girls rested heavily on her shoulders, almost physically bending her under its pressure. Each new day brought with it a fresh layer of desperate urgency, turning every lost minute into a small agony. Lisa had become completely unreachable, refusing even to stay in the same room as Sarah. The teenager had built a fortress of hostility around herself that not even her younger sister could penetrate. During one particularly difficult attempt at conversation, Lisa erupted, "Why can't you just leave us alone? Haven't they destroyed our family enough already?" The anger in her voice barely masked an underlying terror that Sarah recognized, but couldn't yet fully decipher. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to wither a little more each day, like a flower deprived of light. Her drawings, once filled with vibrant colors, were now dominated by dark shadows and solitary figures. Aunt Margaret mentioned that the young girl had started having violent nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, screaming for her father and, curiously, for her sister as well. The judicial system itself seemed to conspire against them, with deadlines being shortened and appeals denied at an unprecedented pace. The judge, apparently eager to close the case that had captured the media's attention, grew increasingly impatient with Sarah's attempts to introduce new evidence. During one particularly frustrating hearing, his words cut like knives. "Miss Bennett, this court will not tolerate dilatory tactics based on speculation and conspiracy theories." The look of satisfaction on Prosecutor Hayes's face at that moment had been almost unbearable, as were the approving murmurs from the gallery, where the victim's family sat with their eyes fixed on Sarah, a mixture of anger and accusation burning in their gaze. The news of the denial of John's final appeal hit Sarah's office like a bombshell. The judicial document, written in cold and impersonal language, stated that all attempts to present new evidence had been exhausted. In her office, Now a chaotic mess of papers and photographs, Sarah sat motionless, staring at the wall where she had mapped the entire investigation. The red lines connecting events and people now seemed to mock her, like veins of a lifeless body. Lisa's notebook, her most promising discovery, had been deemed inadmissible as evidence on technical grounds. Fruit of an unauthorized search, the judge had ruled. The countless hours of investigation, the sleepless nights, the promises made to Emma, all now seemed like nothing more than a futile exercise in hope against insurmountable odds. The face of her own father, who had died in prison years before his innocence was proven, seemed to stare at her from the photograph on her desk, a silent reminder that sometimes the system wins, no matter how hard one fights against it. John Miller received the news with a calmness that devastated Sarah more than any violent reaction ever could. Sitting across from her in the prison visitation room, his words came out soft, almost like a sigh of relief. "Maybe it's better this way, Sarah. Some truths cost too much." His hands, once restless during their conversations, now rested calmly on the table as if he had finally accepted his fate. What disturbed Sarah most was not his resignation, but the flicker of something close to peace in his eyes, as though the certainty of defeat was preferable to the agony of hope. When the guards came to escort him back to his cell, he turned to her one last time. "Just promise me you'll take care of my girls, especially Lisa. She'll need more than she realizes." The way his voice trembled when he mentioned his elder daughter carried a weight that Sarah was only now beginning to truly understand. That night at home, Sarah faced her own breaking point. The wine in her glass had grown warm and untouched as she mentally replayed every decision, every move she had made in the case. The voices of doubt in her mind had turned into a deafening chorus. Perhaps Prosecutor Hayes was right. Perhaps she was only prolonging the suffering of everyone involved. Emma's hopeful face every time Sarah arrived now haunted her like a silent accusation. Aunt Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You're giving those girls hope just to have it ripped away again." For the first time since taking on the case, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that she was doing more harm than good, that her crusade for justice was only adding more layers of trauma to an already shattered family. With trembling hands, she began gathering the case files, preparing to do what she had sworn she would never do: give up. The sound of small, hesitant footsteps in the hallway interrupted Sarah's moment of surrender. Emma stood in the doorway of her office, still wearing her unicorn pajamas, her eyes red from crying but with a surprising determination on her young face. In her hands, she held not just her precious diary but also something new, a small time-worn shoebox. "Lisa hides this under the bed," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "She looks at it every night when she thinks I'm asleep, and she always cries after." Emma's small hands shook as she held out the box, as though its weight was far heavier than just the physical. "I promised Dad I wouldn't tell," she continued, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. "But I can't let him die too. I can't lose anyone else." The devastating simplicity of her words hit Sarah like lightning, brutally reminding her that while the adults were lost in legal procedures and technicalities, a child carried the crushing weight of the truth in her heart. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the box, and its contents made her heart stop. Inside, carefully arranged, were items that seemed insignificant at first glance: old receipts, crumpled notes, a broken bracelet. But to Sarah, with her years of experience, they immediately stood out as pieces of a much larger and darker puzzle. At the bottom of the box, folded several times, was a piece of paper that made her blood run cold, a handwritten confession, unsigned but written in an unmistakably adolescent hand. The opening words were enough to change everything. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Sarah looked at Emma, who was now silently sobbing, and felt a new wave of determination surge through her. The truth was right there in front of her, guarded by a child who understood more about loyalty and sacrifice than any adult in the courtroom. In that moment, Sarah knew she couldn't give up. Not for John, not for Emma, not even for Lisa, but for the truth itself, which was begging to be revealed. Sarah's office had transformed into a war room in the battle against time. The walls, once methodically organized with evidence and timelines, now exploded with new connections and theories, red lines crisscrossing frantically between photographs, documents, and hastily scribbled notes. The contents of Emma's box were spread across her desk like pieces of a macabre puzzle that needed to be solved in record time. The words from the confession burned in her mind as she worked tirelessly, connecting each new point with an urgency that felt almost palpable. Coffee had been replaced with something stronger, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of nights turned into endless extensions of days that seemed to have no end. The execution date, marked in red on her calendar, pulsed like a dying heart, constantly reminding her that every wasted second brought them closer to the irreversible. The unsigned confession from Lisa had opened the door to an even more intricate labyrinth of family secrets and buried truths. Sarah now re-examined every testimony, every police report with fresh eyes, searching not just for evidence but for the silences in between, the pauses in interviews, the hesitations in statements, the averted gazes during interrogations. Her desk was covered with transcripts of Lisa's original interviews, every word now carrying a different weight, every evasive answer screaming a truth that had been waiting to be uncovered all along. Notes scribbled in the margins multiplied like vines, connecting dots that had once seemed unrelated, revealing a pattern that was simultaneously terrifying in its implications and heartbreakingly clear in its meaning. Time seemed to move in contradiction, dragging during the long hours of analysis and investigation, yet flying whenever Sarah glanced at the calendar. The pressure was magnified by the daily calls from Aunt Margaret, who reported that Emma barely slept, tormented by nightmares, and that Lisa had become a shadow of her former self, wandering the house like a ghost, burdened by an invisible weight. Visits to the prison had become exercises in self-control for Sarah, who now had to look John in the eye, knowing the full truth about his sacrifice, while he continued to maintain his facade of resignation, more concerned about his daughter's well-being than his own life. During her last visit, he had held her hands across the table and whispered, "Don't let them lose each other, Sarah, no matter what happens." Those words now echoed in her mind as she worked, reminding her that she wasn't just racing against time to save a life, but to preserve what little remained of a family already devastated by too many tragedies. The revelation came during an especially exhausting early morning, when Sarah finally unraveled the full significance of the items in Emma's box. The broken bracelet, which at first seemed like nothing more than an unimportant piece of adolescent jewelry, bore an inscription partially worn away that matched a series of purchase records found among Lisa's papers. The pattern of dates, when aligned with events leading up to the crime, painted a devastating picture of secret meetings, elaborate lies, and a forbidden relationship that had culminated in tragedy. The handwritten confession, now fully analyzed, revealed not just the act itself but the entire web of events that had led to that fatal moment, a frightened teenager trying to protect a secret that had spiraled beyond her control, and a father willing to sacrifice everything to ensure his daughter wouldn't lose, not just her freedom but her youth and future. Sarah's hands trembled as she arranged the evidence in chronological order. The receipts from the diner near Lisa's school were not mere records of casual meals, but documentation of regular meetings with someone who should never have been in her life. The handwriting on the crumpled notes, when compared with official documents, revealed an even more disturbing truth. The victim was not a random stranger, but someone who had taken advantage of the vulnerability of a teenager, still grappling with the loss of her mother. Lisa's journal entries, once cryptic and confusing, now told a clear story of manipulation, threats, and a final confrontation that had ended in the worst possible way. John Miller hadn't simply taken the blame for a crime. He had placed himself between his daughter and a system that would have destroyed her, choosing to bear a burden that was never his to protect not only Lisa, but Emma as well, shielding them from a truth that could shatter the fragile remains of their family. The discovery hit Sarah with a physical force that made her stagger in her chair. Prosecutor Hayes, in his relentless pursuit of justice, had built his narrative on a foundation of half-truths and assumptions, never imagining that the real story was infinitely more complex and painful. The evidence he had used to convict John, the tools from the shop, the witnesses who had seen him in the area, the timeline records, were all part of an elaborate smokescreen, carefully constructed by a desperate father to create an alibi that would protect his daughter. Each piece of the puzzle Sarah now pieced together revealed deeper layers of sacrifice and unconditional love, transforming what had seemed like a straightforward murder case into a modern Greek tragedy where there were no winners, only varying degrees of loss and pain. The sound of Sarah's phone breaking the silence of the early morning startled her. It was Emma, her small, frightened voice trembling through the line. "Aunt Sarah, Lisa's crying again. She's talking to herself in her room, saying she can't take it anymore." The urgency in the little girl's voice was a painful reminder that this wasn't just a legal investigation, but a race against time to save not only John's life, but the mental stability of his daughters. The weight of the newly uncovered truth felt even heavier now. Sarah held in her hands not only the evidence to save an innocent man, but also the power to completely destroy the future of a teenage girl. John's words during their last visit now took on a devastating clarity. Some truths truly cost too much. In the silence of her office, as the sun began to rise over a still sleeping city, Sarah realized she had found not only the key to freeing John Miller, but also a moral responsibility that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The morning found Sarah meticulously organizing each piece of evidence into a sequence that would leave no room for doubt. Lisa's handwritten confession was carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, alongside the receipts, notes, and bracelet that silently told the true story behind the crime. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she labeled each document and photograph, constructing a narrative that even the most skeptical judge could not ignore. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with every passing minute, constantly reminding her that John's execution was scheduled in exactly 3 days. The pressure of time turned every decision into a precarious balancing act between urgency and precision. One single error in presenting the evidence could cost not only John's life, but the future of his entire family. As a soft knock at the door interrupted her concentration, it was Emma, her wide, frightened eyes revealing she hadn't slept. The girl clutched something in her hands, a letter she had written during the night, addressed to the judge. "I know Lisa will hate me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a painful maturity far beyond her 9 years. "But I can't let Dad die." Sarah's heart clenched as she realized that this child had grasped something the adults in her life were desperately trying to shield her from. Sometimes saving someone means hurting someone else you love. With reverent care, Sarah added Emma's letter to the evidence file, knowing those innocent words might carry more power than any legal argument she could construct. The truth, seen through a child's eyes, had a clarity no legal rhetoric could match. The final preparations unfolded in a state of controlled urgency. Every document was scanned and stored in multiple copies, every piece of physical evidence photographed and catalogued. Sarah worked tirelessly, aware that she was assembling not just a legal defense, but a bomb that would shatter the foundations of multiple lives. John's words echoed in her mind as she finalized the last details. Some truths need to stay buried. Now, with all the evidence laid out before her, Sarah fully understood the weight of those words. She wasn't just preparing for a courtroom presentation. She was preparing to rewrite the history of a family, to expose truths that would permanently alter the lives of everyone involved. The folder of evidence rested on her desk like a loaded weapon, waiting for the precise moment to be unleashed. The night before the final appeal brought an unexpected and dramatic twist. Sarah was in her office, drowning in documents and cold cups of coffee, when Emma appeared at the door, still dressed in her unicorn pajamas, but with an expression on her face that made her look decades older. The girl held not just her letter to the judge, but also a worn school notebook that Sarah had never seen before. "I was there," Emma said, her small but firm voice echoing in the silence of the office. "The night it happened. I followed Lisa because I was worried about her. I saw everything." Her words fell like stones into a still pond, creating ripples that threatened to engulf everything in their path. The weight of that confession hung in the air between them, turning the office into an improvised confessional, where a 9-year-old was about to change the course of multiple lives. Emma's initial account came in fragments, punctuated by restrained sobs, each word seeming to cost her immense physical effort. She described how she had noticed the changes in her older sister's behavior in the months leading up to the crime. The secret phone calls, the mysterious outings, the increasingly elaborate lies to their father. One night, driven by a mix of concern and childlike curiosity, Emma had followed Lisa to a meeting she was never meant to witness. The notebook in her hands contained detailed records of that night and several days prior. Observations written with the surprising precision of a child who had unintentionally become the chronicler of a family tragedy. Sarah watched, her heart aching, as Emma's small hands trembled while holding the notebook, her bitten nails revealing the emotional toll of carrying this secret for so long. Emma's decision to speak up now, less than 48 hours before her father's scheduled execution, carried a weight that threatened to crush her small frame. Her next words made Sarah freeze in her chair. "Lisa will hate me forever, but I can't let Dad die. I can't lose anyone else." The devastating simplicity of that statement held volumes of unspoken pain, years of accumulated trauma borne on the shoulders of a child forced to grow up far too quickly. The lamplight cast dramatic shadows across the office, making Emma appear simultaneously smaller and older than her 9 years, a living contradiction of innocence and wisdom forged by events far beyond her control. The pivotal moment came when Emma finally lifted her tear-streaked face to meet Sarah's eyes. "Can I tell the judge everything? Can I make them understand?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying not just the hope of saving her father, but also the crushing weight of potentially destroying her relationship with her sister. Sarah watched as Emma hugged the notebook tightly to her chest like a shield, her small body trembling with the effort of holding back sobs that threatened to break free. In that moment, the lawyer understood she was witnessing not just the emergence of a crucial witness, but the exact instant a child consciously chose to bear a burden that would forever change the fabric of her family. Sarah's office had been transformed into an improvised testimony room with a discreet recorder, capturing every word Emma said. The young girl sat upright in a chair far too large for her, her feet barely touching the floor, while her notebook rested open on her lap like a talisman. Her first words came hesitantly, almost a whisper. "It started on the anniversary of Mum's death. Lisa was different, quieter than usual." Emma then described how she began noticing subtle changes in her sister, whispered phone conversations, hidden messages, secret meetings after school. The initial account, though painful, flowed with surprising clarity, as if Emma had rehearsed these words in her mind hundreds of times, waiting for the moment when she would finally have the courage to say them aloud. Sarah observed, furiously taking notes, as the story unfolded through the eyes of a child forced to grow up far too quickly. The narrative grew more intense as Emma reached the events of the fateful night. Her small hands gripped the edges of the notebook as she described following Lisa to the meeting place, hiding behind bushes and trash containers. "He was yelling at her," Emma recounted, her voice trembling with the memory. "Lisa was crying, saying she was going to tell Dad everything." The account continued, detailing how the argument quickly escalated. Threats were made, secrets hurled as weapons, and then came the moment of violence that would change their lives forever. Emma described the scene with a disturbingly precise clarity, each detail etched into her memory with the cruel sharpness that only trauma can provide. Sarah noticed how the girl's hands trembled more with every word as the narrative approached the critical moment, her sentences now punctuated by long pauses and labored breaths. The most devastating moment came when Emma described Lisa's return home that night. "She didn't see me following her back," Emma continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "She was covered in... there was blood on her clothes. She went straight to her room, but I heard her calling Dad." What followed was even more harrowing. John arriving home early from work, the hushed conversation with Lisa in her room, the muffled sounds of crying that Emma could hear through the thin wall separating their bedrooms. Dad left shortly after, carrying a bag. When he came back much later, his hands were hurt, like he had punched something over and over. Emma paused, her eyes lost in a memory that seemed to consume her from within. "That's when he found me crying in my room. He knew I had seen something. He made me promise never to tell anyone. He said he had to protect Lisa, that we couldn't lose anyone else in our family." The impact of Emma's testimony was visible in everyone present in the room. Sarah had stopped taking notes, her hands frozen over the notepad as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. The social worker called in to be present during the deposition couldn't contain her own tears, but it was Lisa's reaction as she sat listening to her sister's account that broke everyone's heart. The teenager, who had maintained a facade of anger and denial for so long, finally crumbled, Her entire body shook with suppressed sobs as she listened to her younger sister lay bare the truth she had tried so desperately to bury. When Emma finally finished her account, the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled sobs of the two sisters. The most powerful moment came when Lisa finally found her voice. "I'm sorry, Emma," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad." The words seemed to echo off the office walls, carrying the weight of months of guilt and secrets. Emma rose from her chair, hesitantly moving toward her sister, as if afraid of being rejected. When Lisa opened her arms, Emma rushed into her embrace, and the two sisters held each other as if their lives depended on it. Sarah watched the scene with a lump in her throat, fully aware that she was witnessing not just a critical moment in the case, but the beginning of a long and painful healing process for a family shattered by tragedy. The hours leading up to the final hearing turned Sarah's office into a frenzy of activity. Emma's recorded testimony had been transcribed overnight, every word weighing like lead on the paper. Sarah methodically organized the evidence into her case file. Emma's notebook, Lisa's confession, photographs, call records, each piece of the puzzle carefully arranged to tell the story in the precise sequence that could save John Miller's life. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, fully aware that in the hours ahead, she would be responsible not just for the life of one man, but for the future of two young girls who had already lost far too much. The decision to let Emma deliver her letter to the judge in person had not been easy. The girl had insisted, her eyes filled with a determination far beyond her 9 years. "I need to do this. Please, Aunt Sarah." Lisa, who had not left her sister's side since the confession, silently agreed, her own hands intertwined with Emma's in a gesture of unity that had seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. The letter, sealed in a plain white envelope, rested on Sarah's desk like a bomb about to go off. Inside it, not only Emma's testimony, but Lisa's full confession, written during the night through tears and sobs. It was a letter that would irrevocably change the fate of an entire family. In the courthouse waiting room, time seemed to crawl at an excruciating pace. The clock on the wall read 9:45 a.m., its hands dragging as though wading through syrup. The hum of the air conditioning provided a monotonous soundtrack to the tension that filled the space. Sarah watched the two sisters sitting on the polished wooden bench, their hands clasped tightly together, as if daring the world to try and pull them apart again. The bench creaked occasionally under their nervous movements, the sound echoing across the marble corridor. Emma shifted again in her blue dress, the one they had picked especially for today. "Is it wrinkled?" she whispered to Lisa, her small fingers anxiously smoothing the fabric. The letter in her other hand remained pressed tightly against her chest like a shield, the edges of the envelope already slightly bent from being held for so long. Sarah noticed how the girl's new shoes swung rhythmically, not quite touching the floor, betraying the restrained nervousness beneath her composed exterior. "It's perfect, Em," Lisa replied, her voice hoarse from crying the night before. Her gaze remained fixed on the oak double doors of the courtroom, as if sheer determination could pierce through them to glimpse what awaited inside. Her pale complexion contrasted sharply with the dark green blazer she wore, a piece that had belonged to their mother, tailored by Aunt Margaret for this occasion. Sarah could see Lisa's fingers trembling slightly as she repeatedly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture that mirrored her late mother's mannerisms. The sound of purposeful footsteps down the hallway made them all turn. Prosecutor Hayes strode past with the confidence of someone who viewed the hearing as a mere formality. His expensive leather briefcase was clutched against his chest, brimming with meticulously prepared arguments that would soon prove as fragile as a house of cards. He walked by without so much as a glance at them, the lingering scent of his cologne serving as a subtle reminder of his presence. "Aunt Sarah?" Emma's voice was almost a whisper. "What if the judge doesn't want to read my letter?" Her wide eyes brimmed with a worry far too heavy for her 9 years. Before Sarah could answer, Lisa squeezed Emma's hand, her tone firm and unwavering. "He'll read it, Em. He has to." The conviction in Lisa's voice was new, a strength that had begun to emerge since she had finally decided to confront the truth. Sarah checked her wristwatch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. 9:50. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, All the truths buried under layers of fear, love, and sacrifice would come to light. She noticed a bead of sweat sliding down Lisa's temple, leaving a glistening trail on her pale skin. The teenager seemed locked in an internal battle, her emotions swinging between resolve and outright terror. The low hum of people arriving began to fill the corridor. Reporters discreetly positioned themselves, their cameras still lowered in respect of courtroom protocol. A few familiar faces from the community, neighbors, former clients of John's garage, gathered in small groups, their whispers bouncing off the marble walls. Mrs. Thompson stood among them, her face etched with concern as she watched the sisters from a distance, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her purse. A bailiff appeared at the door, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere. 5 minutes, he announced with the professional neutrality of someone who had witnessed countless dramas unfold in these very halls. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders with renewed force. In her mind, she could already see the moment unfolding, the courtroom discovering they had condemned an innocent man, a father who had chosen to face death to protect his teenage daughter from a fate he considered worse than his own. The ramifications of this revelation would extend far beyond this room, far beyond this family. They would ripple outward, potentially shaking the foundations of the entire system, or so she hoped, as she watched the two sisters rise together, their hands still firmly entwined, ready to face the moment that would change their lives forever. The clock in Sarah's office struck 3 a.m., its silent ticks underscoring the urgency of the moment. The lawyer moved between meticulously organized stacks of documents, reviewing every detail of her presentation for the day ahead for the 100th time. The walls, once a chaotic mosaic of evidence and theories, now displayed a clear and devastating narrative. Photographs, documents, and transcripts telling the story of a father's sacrifice that was about to be unveiled to the world. On her desk lay Emma's transcribed testimony, alongside Lisa's handwritten confession, 2 distinct truths that, when combined, held the power to change countless lives. Sarah felt the weight of every word as she mentally rehearsed the argument she would present, fully aware that the slightest hesitation or misstep could cost John Miller his life. In the small conference room next door, Emma and Lisa remained awake despite the late hour. Aunt Margaret had tried to take them home earlier, but the girls had refused to leave. Tomorrow would be the most important day of their lives, and they insisted on staying close to Sarah, as if their presence could somehow influence the outcome. Lisa coached Emma for the 10th time on how to behave in court, how to hold the letter, how to address the judge. The teenager had taken on a protective role over her younger sister, a belated reflection of the example of sacrifice their father had set. Sarah watched the sisters through the glass door, noting how their fingers remained interlocked even in moments of silence, as if letting go might cause their fragile world to crumble once again. The technical preparations for the following day seemed endless. Sarah had coordinated with the court staff to ensure Emma could hand her letter directly to the judge, a break in protocol made possible only through a special request, citing the girl's young age. Every document had been copied in triplicate, every piece of physical evidence photographed and catalogued with obsessive precision. John's courtroom suit was already set aside, a simple yet dignified outfit, chosen to emphasize his humanity in front of the jury. On Sarah's desk, a cup of coffee grew cold and untouched as she rehearsed her opening statement for the 100th time. Your Honor, what we present today is not just new evidence, but the revelation of a sacrifice that defies our understanding of paternal love. The words felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what was about to unfold, but they would have to suffice. Within hours, they would be all that stood between John Miller and execution. Sarah gathered her small team in the office one last time as the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds. The plan had been meticulously choreographed. First, she would formally request that Emma be heard as a special witness, justifying the procedural deviation based on her age and the exceptional nature of the case. The letter would be the pivotal surprise, a document the judge could not ignore once it was in his hands. Lisa would remain in the gallery until the crucial moment when her own testimony would be necessary to corroborate her younger sister's revelations. The sequence of events had been planned with surgical precision, each move calculated for maximum emotional impact without appearing rehearsed or manipulative. The supporting documents were organized into 3 distinct folders, each representing a different phase of the presentation. The first folder contained evidence that dismantled the original timeline presented by the prosecution: receipts discovered at the 11th hour, inconsistencies in witness statements, and gaps in the initial investigation. The second folder held the most delicate materials: Emma's journal with her detailed observations, proof of the abusive relationship Lisa had hidden, and the physical evidence John had deliberately altered to assume guilt. The third and most crucial folder contained Lisa's full confession, carefully drafted during the night with the assistance of the social worker, alongside a preliminary psychological analysis explaining her trauma and the motivations behind both her actions and her subsequent silence. The presentation strategy had been rehearsed repeatedly with the team. Sarah knew she had to strike a delicate balance, exposing Lisa's truth without villainizing her, revealing John's sacrifice without diminishing the original victim's tragedy, and advocating for justice without directly attacking the system that had failed so profoundly. The photographs chosen for the presentation were selected with extreme care, images that humanized the Miller family without appearing overly sentimental. The final photo, showing John with his daughters and late wife, was reserved for the concluding moment, a silent reminder of what was truly at stake in this case. Amid the flurry of preparations, Sarah couldn't help but notice how Emma watched every move with sharp, observant eyes, absorbing each detail as if trying to memorize how the truth she had carried for so long would finally be revealed to the world. The timing of the revelations was the linchpin of the strategy. Sarah had decided Emma should deliver her letter to the judge immediately after the initial presentation of inconsistencies in the original case. This specific moment had been chosen carefully. It would be when the judge was most receptive to considering new evidence, but before Prosecutor Hayes could mount a defense against the revelations. The letter itself had been placed in a simple white envelope, the kind a child might use for a school assignment. This simplicity was intentional. It was meant to starkly contrast with the devastating weight of its contents. Lisa, who had spent the previous night rereading and approving every word of Emma's confession, now sat quietly in the corner of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the final preparations for the moment that would irrevocably change her life. Night fell over the city like a heavy blanket, shrouding Sarah's office in shadows that seemed to pulse with the tension of the moment. Emma had finally fallen asleep on the conference room couch, still clutching the letter that would change everything, her restless sleep punctuated by soft murmurs and agitated movements. Lisa sat beside her sister, gently running her fingers through Emma's hair in a protective gesture that felt like both an apology and a silent promise. Through the office window, the city lights flickered like silent witnesses to this improbable vigil. An exhausted lawyer, 2 sisters bound by the weight of a secret about to be revealed, and the looming shadow of a father who had sacrificed everything to protect his family. Sarah had secured a special nighttime visit to the prison just hours before the execution was scheduled to take place. John Miller, sitting across from her in the visitation room, appeared eerily calm for a man facing his fate in less than 12 hours. When Sarah began outlining the plan, he gently interrupted her. "Don't tell me. If it doesn't work tomorrow, I don't want the girls thinking they could have done something differently." His words, heavy with a wisdom born of suffering, made Sarah swallow hard. Before she left, he handed her 2 envelopes, one for each of his daughters with specific instructions. They were to be opened only if everything went wrong. The weight of those envelopes in Sarah's blazer pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Back in her office during the final hours before dawn, a special kind of silence filled the air, not the empty stillness of night, but one laden with unspoken hopes and fears. The old building creaked occasionally, its familiar sounds now carrying a different weight in the quiet of the early morning. The dim light of Sarah's desk lamp cast dancing shadows across walls covered with documents, each page a fragment of the story they hoped to tell the following day. Aunt Margaret had arrived around midnight, carrying a basket that seemed to hold all the comfort she could manage to bring. "I brought the blankets their mother used to save for movie nights," she whispered to Sarah, her hands brushing over the soft fabric with reverence. They always said those blankets made them feel safe, no matter what was going on outside. There were also pillows with freshly laundered cases, their faint scent of fabric softener, conjuring memories of simpler times. With careful maternal gestures, Margaret transformed the austere office into something resembling an impromptu campsite, spreading the blankets over the leather sofa and arranging the pillows as if constructing a nest of protection. "They used to build forts with these blankets," Margaret said softly, draping one over Emma's shoulders. "Mary always told them that whatever was happening outside, inside their little fort, they were safe." Her voice trembled slightly at the mention of her late sister, and Sarah noticed her blinking quickly to hold back tears. The clock on the wall read 3:40 a.m., its soft ticking punctuating the silence as a constant reminder of the time they still needed to endure before dawn. Lisa had resisted sleep for hours, sitting on the windowsill and watching the city lights. "What if it doesn't work tomorrow?" she had asked earlier, her voice small and scared, sounding younger than her 16 years. "What if I've destroyed our family forever?" Emma, who had been scribbling in her diary, immediately stood and wrapped her sister in a hug that seemed far too big for her tiny frame to offer. Now the two had finally succumbed to exhaustion, asleep on the sofa that seemed almost destined for this moment. Sarah watched the Miller sisters, noting how their bodies unconsciously sought comfort in each other, even in sleep. Emma's arm was draped protectively over her older sister, a reversal of their usual roles that spoke volumes about how their dynamics had shifted. Even in her sleep, Lisa's hand remained tightly clasped around the necklace their mother had left her, a habit Sarah had noticed intensified during moments of anxiety. The scene stirred painfully vivid memories for Sarah of her own childhood. She remembered similar nights, curling up in her bed and praying fervently for her father's release. Her mother's rosary beads had left marks on her small hands from clutching them so tightly during her nightly prayers. The difference was that back then, no one had been able to turn those prayers into action, those hopes into reality. Now surrounded by meticulously organized piles of evidence and carefully crafted plans, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility as something almost tangible. Tomorrow she would have the chance to do what no one had done for her family, turn the truth into justice, even if that truth came with its own painful price. Her eyes moved over Emma's letter, the diary she had guarded for so long, and the confessions Lisa had finally been able to put on paper. Each document was a piece of a larger puzzle, one she was determined to assemble correctly this time. The light beginning to seep through the blinds signaled not just the arrival of dawn, but the promise of a new day that could change everything. Sarah adjusted herself in her chair, allowing a rare moment of vulnerability as she watched the girls sleep. In a few hours they would face the moment that could redefine their lives, but for now, in this small improvised sanctuary, there was only the sound of their soft breaths and the silent hope that this time the truth would be enough. The courtroom was unusually crowded that morning, the air heavy with a mix of tension and anticipation that seemed to electrify every breath. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators who had gathered to witness what the local media had dubbed the last desperate attempt to save John Miller from execution. In the front row, Emma sat stiffly in her new blue dress, clutching the letter tightly in her small hands as if it were a lifeline. Beside her, Lisa kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers intertwined with her younger sister's in a grip that spoke volumes of the fear and guilt that words could not express. Aunt Margaret, seated behind the girls, alternated between nervously running her fingers over the rosary in her lap and wiping away silent tears that refused to stay hidden. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as more people filtered in, including reporters discreetly setting up in the back. Familiar faces from the community, neighbors and former clients of John's garage, filled the rows, their murmurs a mix of support, doubt, and morbid curiosity. Mrs. Thompson, standing near the back, watched the sisters intently, her wrinkled hands gripping her purse strap as if willing her strength across the room to them. The sound of the judge's gavel silenced the room. Sarah straightened in her seat, her heart pounding as she prepared to deliver the opening statement that would set the tone for everything to come. She glanced at Emma, who met her gaze with a mixture of determination and fear, and then at Lisa, who still hadn't looked up from the floor. Taking a deep breath, Sarah rose to her feet, knowing that everything they had fought for hinged on what would unfold in the hours ahead. The moment John Miller entered the courtroom, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The faint clinking of his shackles as he was escorted to his seat echoed like a cruel reminder of his dire situation. His eyes immediately sought out his daughter's, and for a brief moment, the mask of resignation he had worn so carefully cracked when he saw Emma holding the letter. The very letter he knew could change everything. Sarah noticed his shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the emotional storm undoubtedly raging within him. Across the courtroom, Prosecutor Hayes shuffled his papers with an air of confidence bordering on arrogance, occasionally casting condescending glances toward the defense. To him, this hearing was nothing more than a procedural step before the execution he believed was inevitable. The entrance of Judge Thompson brought a new wave of tension. His face, weathered by decades of judicial service, betrayed no emotion as he settled into his chair, adjusting his reading glasses with the deliberation of someone who bore the weight of life and death decisions. Sarah rose slowly, acutely aware that every word she spoke needed to be flawless. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor felt unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room fixed on her. The reporters poised with their notepads, the court officers standing in their usual positions, the victim's grieving family sitting as a unified block of restrained anger and sorrow. But it was Emma's eyes she felt most intensely, those young, knowing eyes that silently begged her not to fail, not today when everything was at stake. Sarah began her argument with a calm, measured tone that belied the turmoil inside her. Her opening words rang clear in the charged atmosphere. "Your Honor, what we bring today is not merely a plea for clemency, but the unveiling of a truth that will shake the very foundation of this case." As she methodically laid out the inconsistencies in the original investigation, Prosecutor Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence giving way to a flicker of unease. The meticulous presentation of new evidence, contradictory timelines, overlooked witnesses, and unverified assumptions cast a growing cloud of doubt over the prosecution's narrative. The jury, initially seated with expressions of resigned indifference, began to lean forward, their attention captured by each new document projected onto the courtroom screens. The pivotal moment came when Sarah paused deliberately in her presentation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "we have one final witness. A witness who, due to her age and unique circumstances, we request to address the court in a special capacity." Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed behind his glasses as he watched Emma stand, her small hand still clutching the letter as if it were a lifeline. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the young girl began her slow walk toward the judge. The sound of her new shoes against the wooden floor echoed like a countdown, each step marking the seconds until the truth would finally be revealed. Then, in an unanticipated explosion of emotion, the tension shattered. John Miller, shackled at his table, abruptly stood, the screech of his chair against the floor cutting through the silence like a blade. "Please, Your Honor," he cried, his voice raw with desperation and love. "Let me speak to my daughter. Just for a minute, I'm begging you." His plea echoed through the room, prompting a wave of murmurs and shifting in the gallery. The court officer standing beside him attempted to restrain him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, but John pressed on, tears streaming freely down his face. "Emma, my little girl, I need you to know. I love you. I've always loved you no matter what. God bless your courage and the future of our family." His voice, thick with emotion, reverberated through the courtroom. Emma stopped mid-step, turning to face her father, her eyes wide with shock and filled with tears. "Order in the court!" Judge Thompson barked, his gavel striking the desk with force. The murmurs ceased, but the intensity of the moment hung heavy in the air. The judge looked sternly at John, then at Emma, before letting out a deep sigh. "I should not allow this, but Mr. Miller, you have 1 minute. Only one. Officer, remove his shackles and bring him to the center." The silence that followed was almost deafening as John was escorted to where Emma stood. Kneeling before his daughter, his face wet with tears and etched with a love so profound it seemed to fill the entire room, he spoke softly. "Emma," he began, his voice trembling but full of resolve, "I trust you. You are my strength, the light of our family. No matter what happens, always remember that I love you with all my heart." Emma's small hands reached for his, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I love you too, Daddy. I'll make you proud." The courtroom was frozen, every eye fixed on the father and daughter in a moment of raw, unfiltered humanity that transcended the legal proceedings. When their minute was up, the officer gently guided John back to his seat. His steps were slower, his shoulders heavier, but his expression held a glimmer of peace he hadn't shown before. Emma, with renewed determination, turned back toward the judge, her grip on the letter tightening as she continued her walk. The room, now charged with an almost unbearable emotional weight, watched as the 9-year-old prepared to speak the words that could change everything. The room erupted into a mixture of reactions. Some people openly sobbed, others clapped softly, as if afraid to break the solemnity of the moment. An elderly woman in the gallery murmured, "Thank God," over and over, her hands trembling as she held a lace handkerchief against her lips. The bailiffs, usually impassive, masked their own emotions by adjusting their uniforms or clearing their throats. John Miller stood still for a moment, as if his body needed time to process the fact that he was truly free. It was Emma who made the first move, her small figure rushing across the room with an urgency no one dared to stop. "Daddy!" Her voice was a mix of laughter and tears as she threw herself into his arms. Lisa followed shortly after, her steps more hesitant, burdened by the guilt that would still need to be addressed. But when John opened his other arm to her, all hesitation melted away. The embrace that followed was a living portrait of redemption. John visibly trembled, silent tears streaming down his face as he held his daughters, as if afraid they might vanish. His muffled sobs shook his body, years of suppressed emotions finally finding release. "My girls," he whispered repeatedly, his voice choked, "my little stars." Emma buried her face in his chest, her small fingers clutching at the fabric of his shirt, while Lisa kept her eyes tightly shut, as if trying to engrave every second of this moment into her memory. It was an embrace that carried entire worlds, all the love that had sustained them through the dark months, all the sacrifices that had nearly torn them apart forever, all the pain they would still have to face together. But now, for the first time, it also carried something new: hope. It was as if time itself had paused to allow this family to reconnect, to heal, to begin rebuilding bonds that had been tested but never truly broken. The courtroom was even more crowded on the morning of John Miller's official declaration of innocence. The austere walls of the room seemed to hum with a different energy, not the suffocating tension of the previous days, but an almost electric anticipation. John stood before Judge Thompson, this time without handcuffs, wearing a simple suit that Sarah had prepared for the occasion. His daughters, Emma and Lisa, sat in the front row, their hands joined as they had been throughout this entire journey. Little Emma still clutched her diary to her chest, no longer as a weapon but as a reminder of the truth it contained. Lisa, though visibly shaken, held her head high for the first time in months, her eyes fixed on her father with a mixture of love and remorse that words could never fully express. Judge Thompson removed his glasses with slow, deliberate movements, wiping the lenses with a white silk handkerchief he always kept in the pocket of his blazer. The silence in the room was so profound that the soft ticking of the wall clock could be heard. There was something different about his demeanor today, a gentleness in his gestures that contrasted with his usual formality, as if the gravity of the moment had softened even his sharpest edges. Placing his glasses back on carefully, he adjusted his posture in the leather chair, the faint creak echoing through the room. His voice, when it finally broke the expectant silence, carried a weight that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the courtroom. This court, having reviewed all the new evidence presented, including the extraordinary testimony of Emma Miller. At this point, his eyes briefly turned to the small, courageous figure, and the subsequent confession of Lisa Miller, has no choice but to declare John Miller innocent of all charges. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the room like thunder, each reverberation marking the official end of a nightmare that had consumed the Miller family for countless months. The judge paused, removing his glasses again, this time letting a single tear escape. His next words fell like raindrops after a long drought. Furthermore, this court formally acknowledges the extraordinary sacrifice demonstrated by Mr. Miller, a father who chose to face death to protect his family. Let it be recorded that his act of love transcends our common understanding of justice. The transformation on John's face was almost imperceptible to most of those present, but Sarah, who had learned to read every small nuance of his expressions during the months of legal battles, noticed immediately. It was a subtle softening around the eyes, an almost imperceptible relaxation of the tension lines that had marked his face for so long. The deep furrows on his forehead, which had made him look decades older than his 45 years, began to ease, as if decades of worry were finally starting to lift under the weight of newfound freedom. Emma, who had not let go of her father's hand since the verdict was overturned, was the first to notice the movement at the prosecution's table. "Daddy," she whispered, lightly squeezing his fingers. All eyes in the room turned to Prosecutor Hayes, who was slowly rising from his chair, his normally impassive face now marked by an emotion rarely seen in his 30-year career. The sound of Hayes's shoes echoed in the absolute silence of the courtroom as he crossed the space between the prosecution's table and the defense's. His impeccable suit, which normally served as a shield of authority, now seemed to weigh on his shoulders with the acknowledgement of the moment's magnitude. Stopping in front of John, Hayes adjusted his tie in a nervous gesture that completely humanized his previously intimidating presence. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice, usually strong, now laden with a humility that surprised even his closest colleagues. "As a representative of the state, I owe you more than an apology." He paused, taking a deep breath as if searching for the right words. "I owe you a recognition of the kind of love and sacrifice that transcends our common understanding of justice." Hayes extended his hand, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words could express. John hesitated for a moment, looking first at Emma, then at Lisa, as if seeking permission in their eyes. Lisa nodded slightly, silent tears streaming down her face. "I spent my career believing that justice and law were synonymous," Hayes continued, his hand still extended. "You taught me, Mr. Miller, that sometimes the greatest act of justice can appear, in the eyes of the law, to be its greatest transgression. Your sacrifice not only saved your family, it forced us to question our entire understanding of guilt and innocence." John finally accepted the outstretched hand, rising from his chair in a movement that seemed to carry the weight of all the months of confinement. The handshake that followed between the two men, once adversaries on opposite sides of an apparently insurmountable divide, now united by the recognition of a truth greater than the legal system itself, sparked a wave of emotion that swept through the room like a silent tide. "Thank you," John replied simply, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not for me, but for finally allowing the truth to come to light. My daughters needed this more than I did." Judge Thompson discreetly wiped her own eyes, while the bailiff beside her made no effort to hide his tears. In the gallery, Mrs. Thompson openly sobbed into her lace handkerchief, while Mr. Jenkins put a comforting arm around her shoulders. Sarah watched the scene with a lump in her throat, acutely aware that she was witnessing a rare moment where the institutional walls of the justice system dissolved to reveal the humanity underneath. The afternoon sunlight, streaming through the high courtroom windows, created a pattern of light that seemed to focus especially on the space where the two men still clasped hands, a scene that would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when justice and compassion finally met in perfect harmony. The exit from the courtroom was a moment that would remain etched in the memory of all who witnessed it, like a living portrait of redemption. The heavy oak doors of the building swung open, letting in a rush of fresh air and midday light that made John Miller blink several times, his eyes unaccustomed to natural brightness after months under fluorescent lights. Emma and Lisa, one on each side of their father, supported him both physically and emotionally. Emma firmly holding his right hand, Lisa gently steadying his left elbow as they descended the marble steps worn smooth by time. "Take it slow, Dad," Lisa whispered, noticing his hesitation with each step. "We have all the time in the world now." The sunlight played on his hair, which had begun to show premature streaks of grey at the temples during his months in prison. Emma, still clutching his hand, could not contain her radiant smile, even as tears streamed freely down her face. The crowd gathered on the courthouse steps was larger than anyone had anticipated. Neighbors, former clients, curious onlookers, and reporters formed a sea of faces that stretched all the way to the street. As the family emerged, a reverent silence fell over the crowd, which instinctively parted to form a human corridor through which the Millers could pass. The only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves in the trees lining the courthouse steps and the occasional discreet click of cameras from the more respectful photographers. John Miller?" A trembling voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Thompson, leaning on her carved cane, stepped forward from the crowd. Her wrinkled face was marked with tears, but her smile was radiant. In her time-worn hands she held a small ring of keys, worn from use and familiar to John's eyes. The keys to the mechanic's shop. "We kept everything just as you left it, John," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she extended the keys. "Your customers. We never stopped believing, never." Her words seemed to carry the weight of all those months of waiting and faith. John reached out with his free hand to accept the keys, and for a moment his fingers touched Mrs. Thompson's, a brief but deeply meaningful contact. This first gesture of support seemed to break an invisible barrier. Mr. Jenkins, the owner of the delivery company, stepped forward holding a leather folder. "Your shop documents," he explained, clearing his throat to disguise his emotion. "I kept everything in order, renewed all the licenses." A young mother approached with her small son, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "You fixed my car the day this little one was born," she said softly. "You didn't charge a thing. You said it was your gift for the baby. He's 5 years old now, and we've never forgotten your kindness." The offerings kept coming. A stack of welcome back cards from neighbors, a potted plant for the shop office, even a brand new toolbox. Each item was a small piece of the life John had been forced to leave behind, now being returned with interest, wrapped in love and regret. Sarah watched the scene from the upper steps of the courthouse, standing beside Prosecutor Hayes, who remained silent, visibly moved by the moment. The midday sun created an almost ethereal effect, making the tears on the faces of the crowd glisten like tiny diamonds. "It's as if the entire city is asking for forgiveness," murmured Hayes, more to himself than to Sarah. She nodded slightly, watching as John accepted each gesture, each gift, each word of apology, with the same serene grace that had defined his sacrifice from the beginning. The soft afternoon breeze gently stirred Emma's hair as she took it all in with wide eyes, still holding her father's hand tightly. Lisa, on the other hand, kept a protective arm around her father's shoulders, as if afraid someone might try to take him away again. The Miller family, reunited under the open sky, formed an image of unity and strength that even the most seasoned reporters couldn't help but discreetly wipe their eyes. The impact of the truth revealed in the Miller case rippled far beyond the courthouse steps, creating waves of change throughout the entire justice system. At the Central Police Station, a room previously used for records had been transformed into the operations center for a new special task force. Whiteboards lined the walls, filled with timelines and diagrams of similar cases that needed to be reviewed. Veteran detectives worked side by side with newly trained investigators to identify patterns of false confessions motivated by family bonds. "It's amazing how one case can open our eyes," commented Detective Roberts, a 20-year veteran, as he pinned another photo to the wall. "How many other John Millers are out there? How many parents, siblings, or spouses are taking the blame for something they didn't do?" His partner, Detective Chen, newly assigned to the task force, added another file to the growing stack on her desk. "We've already identified 3 cases just this week with similar patterns." Prosecutor Hayes, who had spent sleepless nights since the conclusion of the Miller case, called a special meeting with his team. The auditorium at the district attorney's office was packed, with prosecutors from different districts gathered to hear his announcement. "What happened in the Miller case cannot be seen as an exception," he began, his voice heavy with both experience and regret. "We need to establish specific protocols to investigate cases where strong family bonds exist. We can no longer afford to accept confessions without questioning the deeper motivations behind them." Sarah had been invited to this meeting and observed from the back of the room as Hayes presented his proposal for a new specialized unit. "This unit," he explained, projecting detailed slides on the screen, "will focus exclusively on investigating claims of false confessions motivated by family ties. We will collaborate with forensic psychologists, social workers, and family dynamics experts." His eyes briefly met Sarah's, a silent acknowledgement of the role she had played in this transformation. In her own office at the Innocence Institute, Sarah watched these systemic changes unfold with a mix of professional satisfaction and personal emotion. Her desk, once dominated solely by the Miller case, now housed a new stack of folders, each representing a different family torn apart by similar secrets and sacrifices. Her assistant, Maria, entered with yet another file. "This just came in," Maria explained. "Another questionable confession case. The pattern is eerily similar to the Millers." The wall behind Sarah's desk, which had once displayed only her diplomas and certificates, now featured a new addition, a framed photograph of the Miller family on the day of John's release, accompanied by a small plaque engraved with the words, "Truth has the power to heal." Beside it, a growing mural of other ongoing cases began to take shape, each representing another family waiting for their chance at redemption. "I never imagined a single case could have such an impact," commented a fellow attorney, glancing at the mural. Sarah smiled softly, adjusting her glasses as she opened another file. "It wasn't just a case," she replied. "It was a 9-year-old girl who taught us that truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to real justice." The phone on her desk now rang constantly. Other attorneys seeking guidance, desperate families looking for help, journalists requesting interviews about the Miller effect, as some had started calling it. Sarah answered each call with the same dedication, aware that the Miller family's sacrifice had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after the headlines faded. On her desk in a modest frame, Sarah kept a drawing Emma had made. A bright star with the words, "The truth sets us free," written in her childish handwriting. It served as a constant reminder that behind every case, behind every file, were real people, real families, waiting for their chance to find the truth and the redemption it could bring. Lisa was navigating her own journey of redemption, a path that proved as challenging as it was necessary. The cozy room of Dr. Martinez, with its soft green walls and comfortable chairs, had become a safe space where Lisa could finally begin untangling the complex knots of guilt and trauma that had built up in her heart. During the first sessions, Lisa could barely speak, her words choked by suppressed sobs. The psychologist, an expert in youth trauma, waited patiently, offering a steady and understanding presence. "It feels like I'm carrying 2 different weights," Lisa explained during a particularly intense session, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her blouse. "The guilt over what happened that night, and then an even bigger guilt over my father's sacrifice." Dr. Martinez nodded gently, offering her a tissue. "And which of those weights feels heavier today?" she asked, her voice gentle, creating a safe space for the hardest truths. Family therapy sessions took place in a larger room, with sofas arranged in a circle and a large window letting in natural light. It was here that John, Lisa, and Emma met weekly to rebuild the bonds that had been tested, nearly to their breaking point. In one such session, Emma surprised everyone by pulling a school art project out of her backpack. "This is our family constellation," she explained, showing a drawing where 3 stars of different sizes were connected by golden lines. "The teacher asked us to draw our family, and I thought, even when it's cloudy and we can't see the stars, they're still up there connected." The silence that followed her words was filled with the quiet tears of John and Lisa. At home, the healing process continued in smaller but equally meaningful ways. Lisa began helping Emma with her homework, something she had stopped doing during the darkest months. The 2 sisters developed a new nighttime ritual, sitting on the porch to watch the stars, sometimes talking, other times just sharing a comfortable silence. "You know," Emma said one evening, her small but firm voice breaking the quiet, "that old diary might have revealed the truth, but we're writing a new story now." The diary in question now rested in a drawer of Emma's desk, carefully wrapped in a silk scarf that had belonged to their mother. It was no longer the frightening repository of secrets it once was, but rather a testament to the courage it took to face the truth, no matter how painful. Occasionally, Emma would take it out just to touch its cover, as if to remind herself of the power the truth had to set them free. John also participated in individual therapy sessions, working to process his own trauma and learning how to cope with the lingering fears that still woke him some nights. "Sometimes," he admitted during a family session, "I still check the girls' rooms at night just to make sure they're really there." Hearing this, Lisa reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture but one filled with deep, mutual understanding. Dr. Martinez introduced several therapeutic techniques to help the family process their trauma. One involved writing letters, not to send, but to express feelings that were difficult to verbalize. Lisa wrote one to her mother, pouring out all the pain and regret she had carried onto page after page. "I just wish she could tell me she forgives me," Lisa said during one session, her voice trembling. "Your mother lives on through the love your father has shown," the therapist responded gently. "What greater proof of forgiveness could you have?" The process was slow, but the change was visible. Lisa's smiles, once rare and forced, began to appear more naturally. Her school grades, which had plummeted during the most challenging period, started to improve. Most significantly, she began making plans for the future, something that for a long time had felt like a luxury she didn't deserve. The community surrounding the mechanic's shop underwent its own transformation, just as profound, but quieter. The building, which for months had stood like a ghostly structure marked with police tape and surrounded by whispers of condemnation, gradually regained its soul. John dedicated an entire week to cleaning and reorganizing, with Lisa insisting on helping him repaint the exterior. The shade of blue they chose was a few tones lighter than the original, a subtle change that seemed to symbolize a fresh start. "We need to replace that old sign," Lisa remarked one morning, pointing to the faded lettering on the shop's sign. John paused his work, wiping grease from his hands with an already stained cloth. "Your mother chose that font," he replied softly. Emma, who was organizing tools on one of the workbenches, approached with a suggestion. "We can keep the same style, Dad. Just make it new and brighter." The first days after reopening brought a steady procession of cars and familiar faces. Mrs. Thompson was the first to arrive, her old sedan making noises she admitted through tears she had purposely ignored for weeks, just waiting for this moment. "No one else touches my car, John," she declared firmly, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him the keys. "I trust only you." Mr. Jenkins came shortly after, his delivery van in need of a tune-up that any other shop could have handled. As John examined the engine, the long-time customer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "You know, John, back then, I should have spoken up, defended you more." John emerged from under the hood, looking at his old friend with kind eyes. "You're here now, Jenkins, that's what matters." The shop quickly became busier than it had ever been. Some cars genuinely needed repairs, but others were little more than transparent excuses for their owners to offer their own words of remorse and reconciliation. An elderly woman brought in her perfectly functional car, insisting she heard a strange noise. While John politely pretended to search for the non-existent problem, she filled Emma's hands with homemade cookies and left an envelope of money that John tried unsuccessfully to return. John accepted every gesture, every poorly disguised apology, every attempt at compensation with the same quiet grace that had defined his sacrifice. For him, every repair became an opportunity to rebuild not just machines, but also the communal bonds that had been so severely tested. His hands, which had never lost their skill with tools, now seemed to carry an additional power to heal. Lisa began spending more time at the shop after school, initially just watching her father work, but soon showing a genuine interest in learning the trade. "Will you teach me?" she asked one afternoon, holding a wrench as if it was something precious. John's smile lit up his entire face. "Come here," he said, motioning her closer. "I'll show you how your mom used to organize the tools. She had her own system." The walls of the shop, once stripped bare after the police investigations, were beginning to come back to life. Old photos were rehung, now accompanied by new memories. Emma insisted on hanging colorful drawings among the technical certificates, adding a cheerful contrast to the tools and machinery. The wall calendar, which previously only marked service appointments, now also highlighted community events, a charity barbecue here, a street fair there. The transformation was so complete that the shop was gradually becoming more than just a place of work. It was a living testament to how the truth, even when painful, had the power to heal and transform. The characteristic smell of oil and metal now mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee, courtesy of Mrs. Thompson, who insisted on bringing a thermos every morning, and occasionally with the scent of cakes and pies that customers casually left on the counter. 6 months after John's release, the small garden at the Miller home had transformed into a living symbol of renewal. The flowers that Mary, the girl's mother, had planted years ago were blooming again under Lisa's dedicated care, who had discovered gardening as a form of therapy. The bed of red roses, once neglected, now burst with vibrant colors, their petals swaying gently in the evening breeze. The setting sun painted the sky in an impressionist palette of golds and pinks, creating an almost ethereal backdrop. For a moment, Sarah, a special guest for dinner, knew she would cherish forever. "Dad, look! I caught another one!" Emma shouted, her cupped hands gently holding another firefly. She ran across the freshly mowed lawn, leaving footprints in the grass still damp from the irrigation system John had repaired the previous weekend. Her floral dress billowed with each movement, and her laughter, now more frequent and carefree, echoed through the garden like a melody that had been absent for far too long. "Show Aunt Sarah, sweetheart," John called from the table set under the large oak tree. It was the same tree where years ago he used to push the girls on a swing until his arms ached. The old swing was still there, its ropes recently replaced, swaying gently in the evening breeze as a quiet reminder of simpler times. Lisa was helping set the table, carefully placing plates on the white lace tablecloth their mother used for special occasions. Her movements were more fluid now, more confident. Though she still carried the invisible scars of her experience, something in her demeanor had changed. Therapy was helping, but it was more than that. It was as if every small act of forgiveness, every reclaimed moment of joy, was gradually dissolving the weight of guilt that had clouded her eyes for so long. "I remembered to bring Mom's favorite dessert," Lisa said, placing a covered dish at the center of the table. "Apple pie with cinnamon. Aunt Margaret taught me the recipe." Her eyes met her father's, and they shared a moment of silent understanding. John smiled, reaching out to gently touch his daughter's arm. "She would be so proud of you," he said, his voice carrying that unique blend of joy and longing that had become familiar over the past months. "Of both of you." Emma approached the table, still holding her captive firefly. "Can I make a wish before I let it go?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with the same light as the little insects dancing through the garden. "What more could you wish for?" Lisa teased lovingly, running her fingers through her sister's hair. "We have everything we need right here." Sarah watched the scene with a lump in her throat, acutely aware that she was witnessing something precious. The table set in the garden, with its candles protected by glass jars Emma had painted at school, the family's plates carefully arranged, and the aroma of apple pie mingling with the scent of roses, it was a living tapestry of healing and renewal. The garden lights began to turn on automatically as night approached, casting a soft glow that blended with the remaining natural light. John had installed the lights himself, part of his ongoing project to transform the garden into a sanctuary for his rebuilt family. Every small detail, from the Japanese lanterns hanging from the lower branches of the oak to the flower pots strategically placed around the lawn, was a testament to the transformative power of truth and forgiveness. The entire scene seemed framed by a golden light that didn't just come from the setting sun, but seemed to emanate from the happiness slowly returning to inhabit this space. It was as if every hardship, every tear shed, every battle fought had been necessary to create this new version of family, a version stronger, deeper, and more aware of the value of every shared moment. During dinner, the conversation flowed with a natural ease that felt like a precious gift after so many months of separation and forced silences. The aroma of Aunt Margaret's homemade lasagna, John's favorite, filled the air, blending with the soft scent of the candles Emma had insisted on lighting to make the night special. The gentle clinking of silverware against the family's plates, wedding gifts from the girl's late mother, created a familiar and comforting melody. "Do you remember how Mom always insisted on using these plates on Sundays?" Emma asked, tracing her finger delicately along the plate's gold rim. Even when it was just for pizza, her comment drew smiles from everyone at the table, including Sarah, who watched the scene with her heart full. "She used to say that every family meal was a special occasion," John replied, his voice thick with emotion yet steady. He paused, serving himself more salad, a mundane gesture that now carried a special weight after months of institutional meals in prison. "I think I finally understand what she meant." Lisa, who had been quieter, toyed with the food on her plate, moving pieces around without actually eating, her eyes occasionally filled with tears that she quickly tried to blink away. They were no longer tears of pain or guilt, but of a gratitude so profound it seemed to overflow unbidden. "Dad," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking maybe we could reopen the shop together. I want to learn everything you can teach me." The words came out hesitantly, as though she still wasn't sure she deserved to make plans for the future. John set his fork down gently, his eyes locking with his daughter's in a way that made Sarah hold her breath. "Nothing would make me happier, sweetheart. Nothing." The smile that lit up Lisa's face at that moment seemed to hold all the light that had been absent over the past months. At that moment, Lisa couldn't contain the emotion that consumed her. She rose from her chair abruptly, the napkin falling to the floor as she moved. In just a few steps, she was by her father's side, and without a word she wrapped her arms around him in a hug that seemed to want to make up for every lost embrace, every moment stolen from them. John held her tightly, as if he had been waiting for this moment since the day he was taken away. Emma didn't hesitate for a second. Dropping her fork mid-bite, she practically leapt from her chair to join the hug. Her small arms tried to encircle both her father and sister, as if willing her family to stay together through sheer determination. Time seemed to suspend its usual flow in that moment. The soft candlelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that moved as if in their own silent rhythm. The clock on the wall ticked gently, but its sound felt distant, as though even it respected the sanctity of this moment. It was as if the entire universe had paused to witness this reconciliation, this sacred moment where a broken family found its way back to wholeness. Sarah, still seated at the table, felt her own tears slide silently down her cheeks. As a lawyer, she had witnessed countless moments of victory in courtrooms, but none compared to this, a victory not just of justice, but of love in its purest, most sacrificial form. The scene before her was living proof that some wounds, no matter how deep, could heal, and that some bonds were too strong to be broken, even by the harshest trials. Before leaving, Sarah stopped by John's small office, a space that had once been merely functional for storing paperwork, but had now transformed into something far more meaningful. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the window, its newly hung curtains casting delicate patterns on the fresh rug Lisa had picked to brighten the room. The faint scent of polished wood mingled with the aroma of new books, a small library the family was building together, each volume a promise of shared reading nights they had missed during their months apart. The walls, once bare and impersonal, now displayed a growing collection of captured moments since John's release, snapshots of reclaimed smiles, spontaneous hugs, and modest celebrations of a normalcy hard-won. In one corner, Emma had claimed a small workspace for herself. A light wooden desk, handcrafted by John in the shop, stood neatly against the wall. Resting on it was her new journal, bound in soft blue leather, a deliberate choice to distance it from the school notebook that had once carried the weight of her secrets. Sarah approached quietly, noticing how the light played on the golden lettering engraved on the cover, "Memories of Our Star." The pages, mostly blank, held the promise of a story different from the one they had lived. The first page lay open, revealing Emma's careful handwriting, each word written with a determination far beyond her 9 years. "Our family is like a star. Even on the darkest nights, we keep shining together." As Sarah prepared to leave, she heard the laughter of the girls coming from the garden, mingled with John's deep, gentle voice. The sound drifted through the open windows like a melody of healing, reminding her that some stories, even the most painful ones, could find not just an ending, but a new beginning. The office had become more than a sanctuary of memories. It was a living testament that love, when rooted in truth, had the power to rebuild not only spaces, but also hearts. Did you enjoy the story of John Miller and Sarah Bennett? If so, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and check out the next story waiting for you here on the screen. See you there.